Welcome to Northern Narratives, the podcast where history comes alive through the voices of those that lived it. I'm Nick Kellner, and each episode I sit down with someone who lived through a pivotal moment in our nation's past. From soldiers to internees, residential school and atomic bomb survivors, these are the stories of the people behind the headlines, the lived experiences too often overlooked. Together, we'll humanize history and connect the past to the present, one conversation at a time. In our inaugural episode, we investigate what happens when a nation turns its back on its own citizens. The forced relocation, dispossession, and internment of almost 22,000 Japanese Canadians during the Second World War remains a dark mark on our timeline. In early 1942, following the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor and attacks against Canadian soldiers stationed in Hong Kong, the government, without justification, charge, or due process, exiled Japanese Canadian families on the West Coast to remote camps in the interior of the province. Kimiko Yamada was born in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1939 and was very young when her family found themselves labeled as enemy aliens by the Canadian government under the War Measures Act. This interview was recorded on the last day of 2021 at Kim's home in Ontario.
Photos from 1939 to 1942. They were very happy memories. My mom and dad were always at the beach, Kitsilano Beach. They would go to Stanley Park. They would go to various places, always on the weekends. And I think I had a very happy childhood. And then suddenly I didn't know what happened. And I saw that my parents were busily packing and trying to sell things. They're trying to sell their house. I didn't understand all that. And then after that happened, my mother and I ended up in Hastings Park, which was a former livestock building, and the government decided that they were going to house as many Japanese as they could in this livestock building, which wasn't really ready for, it was terrible terrible conditions. But anyway, that's where we moved. So it was my mother and I. My father was, and all the men were to register with the BC Securities Commission and then assigned to some place, and I wasn't sure where. I didn't know then where he was assigned to. So it was just my mother and I in Hastings Park. My father arrived in Canada when he was 19 years old in 1924. He was indentured to a farm for 2 years, and after that he came back to Vancouver and worked as a gardener. So he worked as a gardener right up until he was sent off to the road camps. So that was his background. He had gone back to Japan to marry my mother, and in 1936, my mother came to Canada in 1937, and I was born in 1939. So it's a very happy family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you have any other siblings, or is it just you?
Myself, I have, there were 5 of us. I have 2 brothers. One brother passed away just recently, but I had 2 brothers and three of us, 3 girls.
And you are the oldest?
I'm the eldest.
The eldest.
Yeah, because I was born in 1939. Right. I had a brother who was born in one of the internment camps, then a sister that was born in an internment camp. And so, yes, there were 5 of us.
And so you had mentioned that your
father received, was it a letter that he was then sent away to one of these work camps?
I believe the assignment was done when he had registered. So he knew where he was going. I didn't. I just suddenly, everything was in chaos and I didn't know what was going on. I was frightened at Hastings Park. My mother and I were assigned a cage and didn't know any better. To this day, I have visions of bars and I could never figure out what these bars were. When I went on my tour in 2019, I realized what it was. It was the cages. And so I remember that the little children were told to go and eat at a mess hall on their own. Like the children apparently were given better food. And so I remember screaming and running away and hiding, because I was afraid. I'd lost my father. I thought I was going to lose my mother. So I remember those traumatic moments. And then I remember apparently I had developed mumps. And I was isolated in an infirmary. But apparently in the infirmary area, there were adults with tuberculosis. And so I was confined with them. So I remember being frightened. I remember being very frightened about being taken away from my parents because I had lost my father and then wasn't sure about my mother. So that was pretty well what I remember about Hastings Park. It was very traumatic, very traumatic. Mm.
I understand that you were quite young during all these events, born in 39, and this is now 1942.
I'm only about 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old.
And so, do you remember that period of time being told, whether that was by your mother, that you were having to pack up belongings and go to Hastings Park? Was there some type of a government announcement, or what was the climate like among people that were brought to this Hastings Park? And what did Hastings Park look like? You mentioned the word cages. What did this atmosphere look like?
Okay, first of all, with the packing, I believe the adults were allowed 150 pounds of luggage. Children, and I'm not sure whether I was considered to be of age, I was allowed 75 pounds of luggage. So that's really not a whole lot, not much. And at that time, when the families were rounded up, and they were only, say, given 2 weeks to pack, to get rid of their things, to sell their belongings, the BC Commission had promised to store the belongings of the families, and I believe many did do that, trusting the government to store their belongings. My father had worked as a gardener so he'd had many regular customers, and there was a family that apparently promised to store my father's belongings. My father had a steamer trunk. Actually, the steamer trunk came with my mother in 1937. From Yokohama. We've got little stickers on it saying Yokohama. Anyway, so they stored whatever they felt was precious and treasures to them, and this family stored it for them. So this is 1942. And we were very fortunate, and later on I will tell you how very fortunate we were. It was valuable, that the things that were stored in the steamer trunk, and the kindness of this man who had actually kept it for us till after the war. Being so young, being afraid I was going to lose my mother, I was very clingy. I remember being very clingy. No, I didn't make any friends. I think we all sort of stuck to, within the family. And we didn't know what was going on, really didn't know what was going on. We were just rounded up and then placed. There was apparently about 8,000 Japanese that went through Hastings Park at one point. And after that, I'm not quite sure when it was closed, when Hastings Park was closed, but it was sort of like a place that people were placed and sent on to various internment camps. So I think when you talk about fearful, I think fear really was losing my mother, I think, after having lost my father. So I think that was the fear that I lived with. And the insecurity. I didn't want to be placed in the mess hall. I didn't want to be placed in the infirmary, thinking that I was going to lose my family.
Next in our interview, Kim describes her journey from the Hastings Park collection station to an internment camp in New Denver. Along the way, her mother is very ill and has to be cared for by her 5-year-old daughter. Once Kim and her mother reach New Denver, they're assigned a cabin to share with another family. After some time in New Denver, Kim describes a growing pride in the society that internees formed there. Her father finally joined the family in 1943 after time spent working in a logging camp in Lempriere, while Kim is welcomed among the older children. She starts kindergarten, learns Japanese adori dancing, and finds a place in a community that welcomes and embraces her.
Certainly, it was not a concentration camp setup. No barbed wires. You didn't see guards with guns, but there were RCMP officers around, making sure that everyone behaved. No, there wasn't. I believe not in any of the internment camps in BC were we treated, as prisoners. I think that we all kind of accepted what had happened to us. And there is a term in Japanese called gambari, which is you just almost, just live with it. And so there was nobody that behaved like an enemy, no one that was ever arrested, everyone did their best to fit into this new life that they had no choice but to fall into. Mm-hmm.
Do you know how long a time you were in the New Denver camp for approximately?
All right, so we ended up in New Denver sometime late 42 and probably there till about 1945, maybe 1945. And then what happened is the government gave, when the war was over, the government gave the Japanese who interned a choice, 2 options. One of the options was that you moved east of the Rockies. You were not allowed to go back to the BC coast. The other option was you signed up to go back to Japan. And they really encouraged that. They really encouraged that. So apparently about 10,000 of the Japanese had signed up to go back to Japan. In fact, my father was one. But there were stories coming back from Japan about the hardships, the suffering, the poverty, starvation. They're saying, don't come back. I know my parents got letters from their family saying, please don't come back. I mean, we're having a hard enough time as it is. Don't come back. So my father, after giving it some thought, decided, okay, well, it's not great here, but it's worse back in Japan. So he decided to stay. So he was one of the ones that decided to stay. Only about 4,000 went back to Japan. of the 10,000. And so that meant then that he had to move out east of the Rockies, which he knew nothing about. And most of the people who decided to go out to the east knew nothing about moving east of the Rockies.
So what happens next for your family?
Okay, so we didn't have any family support. We had, I believe my father had friends, acquaintances, and so what he did was, I believe he kind of followed families to where they were going to. And so some of the families decided to go to a place called Nays, Ontario, which is on the north shore of Lake Superior. And so we had moved on to Nays. So the camp closed and we moved. My father's journal shows that we moved to Nays July 1946. So we ended up in Nays. And I remember, now I'm a little older, I have a bit more memories. So we're on the train. It's taken 3 days for us to go from Tashme to Nays, Ontario, on the train. When the train arrives, we don't go to the station itself. The station itself would have been Coldwell, Ontario. But to let us off at the Nays, and they called it Nays Hostel, and the hostels were huts. And the huts were already there because there were 500 German prisoners of war that had been staying in Nays. When they were sent home, these huts were open, and therefore we were placed there as a relocation camp. Anyway, so then, so we lived in Nays for, and I don't think we were there for a year. We were only there for a very short period. And again, great memories of being right on Lake Superior, the shores of Lake Superior. And we lived, I believe, I'm not sure whether there were about 5 or 6 huts with, I would say, about 40 families living in each one. And we all, again, ate in mess halls, taking turns eating in mess halls. When Nays was closed down, shut down permanently, there were families that still didn't know where to go. And quite often financially, they couldn't move anywhere. So there were logging camps just nearby. And so my family moved to a logging camp. And this particular logging camp only had about 6 families and a bunkhouse. And when that closed, there was another camp we could move to, and there were 18 families. It was more of a community. We moved there, and again, life was wonderful, I thought. Though we lived in tar paper shacks, again, and lived in horrible winter conditions. And we didn't have proper clothing, and the shacks, I remember the shacks with icicles down inside the house, icicles forming inside the house. And the shacks we had a bedroom and a kitchen area with a stove. And we had no running water again, no electricity, outdoor toilet, because no running water, we would have to go to a nearby creek to get buckets of water. I do remember doing that. And as a young child, you have to do all these things. I mean, you're forced to do all these things. So I remember, going down to the creek, getting buckets of water, and filling the water barrel. You see my picture back there?
Oh, the water barrel.
So the water barrel, one of my jobs was to fill the water barrel. But at the creek, I also had to do washing. And because my mother, as I said, was always ill, I had to take on all these jobs. And so I remember, doing the washing in the creek, and of course ice formed. Mm-hmm. So now you've got an axe, and here I am, 9 years old, with an axe chopping away at the ice. And I remember doing washing one day and a moose being just down the river. But, that was normal. That was life. Yeah, but again, in this small community, we had a school. We had two schools. One for the very young, right up to maybe grade 5, and then maybe grade 4, and then grade 5 to grade 8. So we had a system where we had teachers, and again, it was well organized. We would have a truck come by with some groceries. I don't ever remember eating fresh meat, no dairy products, of course, and usually canned goods. And a truck would come by, and I remember my mother buying things with her rations. So really, our diet was very poor. I would say our diet was very poor from 1942 on. Yeah.
Even in smaller communities, families worked to support each other. Education was a constant priority for Japanese Canadians, and classrooms were set up in homes or community centers during the day. Kim recalls elderly residents taking on the role of makeshift educators who used the natural environment around them to promote sustainable living habits. Famed environmentalist David Suzuki connects his harsh experiences during internment with his family in Slocan City as a place where he first discovered a deep appreciation for the natural world. In every camp where Japanese Canadians were tested by harsh weather conditions and a lack of modern resources, the result was a strengthening of their loyalty to one another and their cultural cornerstones. As time passed, families began to leave Nays for occupational opportunities elsewhere across Canada. Kim's family also takes the opportunity to pursue new beginnings in Toronto.
So there's 18 families and communities, and they've almost started to move out. They've got families or somebody that's telling them to come. They've moved to Leamington, they've moved to Chatham, they've moved to various places, mushroom farms. We don't have anyone. So anyway, when my father had come to Toronto to see if he could find something, accommodations. Of course, he's now got 4 kids, Japanese. We just come out of this, horrible discrimination, fear of enemy. He can't find anything. So anyway, to make a long story short, he did eventually find something. And so beginning of July, we moved to Toronto. But we were the second to last family in this community, and it was frightening actually, because now it's a real ghost town. Everybody's moved out. And as families are being moved out to the train station, they're being moved out in open panel trucks. So we're always running after these trucks. Well, we're the second to the last family. It was really quite frightening. I do remember that, yeah. So we moved to Toronto beginning of July. The end of July, my father got word from CPR to say that there was something that belonged to him. And so eventually, I remember seeing it when it arrived in Toronto. I had not seen it since I had not known anything about it from 42 to 48. And then there it was, suddenly this big steamer trunk arrives, and it arrived with what was valuable to them, which was the Buddhist altar and some other things that meant something to them. Hudson's Bay blankets, but most precious of all was photographs from Japan and from my father's early days. As I said, he arrived in 1924. Happy days for him. I see all these wonderful folk. So we have all these valuable things to this day, and I'm very thankful to this man. we're very grateful to this man. To this day, I'm looking for him and his family. Not him, but his family. Just to let them know that all these years later, you know, we appreciate and value the things that he had stored for us. Just a wonderful, wonderful man. I mean, I don't know in those days how anybody would, you know, to show such kindness and understanding, you know.
And you had mentioned your father's connection was that he had been a gardener with this family, and then that's
right.
how they made this connection.
Yes. My father had a journal that he had started in 1932. My father died when he was 92 years old. He kept the journal every day. So therefore, I was able to go back and look at the journal and pick out the names of the people he worked for as a gardener, the addresses, and how much he had made that day. So I have all that information.
And so, obviously, a shift in kind of community and living scenarios from these small, rural, close-knit Japanese Canadian communities where you had spent years of your life to now living in larger, urban, multicultural Toronto. I'm wondering, do you remember any instances of discrimination that you remember against yourself or your family coming out of a time where Japanese Canadians, you know, had been relocated and interned and dispossessed when you went to school as a young person or in your father's journey to try to obtain a job in Toronto?
My father never talked about it, of course, and my mother never talked about it. Myself, I know that when we had bought the house, my neighbor was a friend of mine, and she told me that at that time, you know, people used to rent upstairs. They used to do rooming houses and that kind of thing. So our house, apparently, people used to live upstairs. But they refused to stay when it was a Japanese family that bought it because they heard you could get knifed like, you know, they've seen these movies with swords and all that. And so they were afraid to be knifed at night. So anyway, they refused to stay. So I remember that story, but other than that, you know what? Our life, when we talk about it, there's a street that we call Logan Avenue. There's still a group of us, my brothers especially, they're very close friends. To this day, they're very close friends. And they never thought of being Japanese or being the enemy or anything like that, apparently. And I don't recall being discriminated against. Maybe there was, maybe I was blind to it, you know? But we sort of assimilated and it wasn't a problem.
A big thank you to Kim and a thanks to you for listening. I'd like to leave you with a quote from my favorite historian, the Nobel Prize in Literature winner Svetlana Alexievich, who says, "My wish is to humanize history." Thanks again. Until next time.